No one expected a miracle to begin behind a rusted auto bay where the concrete was permanently darkened by oil stains, and the air carried the metallic scent of heat and labor. Least of all Edrick Vale, who had learned long ago not to expect anything extraordinary from life. He believed in routines, in fixing what broke, in keeping promises small enough that the world could not shatter them. Years later, people would talk about the moment as if destiny had announced itself loudly. But in truth, it arrived quietly, disguised as a mechanical failure. The garage sat at the edge of Monterey Ridge, far from the glass offices overlooking the coast. Its sign was sun-faded, the paint chipped from decades of salt air. Inside, Edrick worked with steady hands, tightening a bolt beneath a lifted sedan while the radio murmured low, the volume kept just soft enough to hear a child's voice from the back room. "Dad, is 7 times 8 really 56, or am I doing it wrong again?" "It's right," Edrick replied without looking up. "You're doing fine." Calder Vale, 9 years old, sat at a folding table surrounded by notebooks and pencils worn down to stubs. He watched his father with the quiet admiration of a boy who had grown up too fast, who understood that asking for attention meant waiting until a job was done. Edrick slid out from beneath the car, wiping his hands on a rag already dark with grease. He was broad-shouldered, his coveralls stretched at the seams, his beard trimmed short out of habit rather than style. There was a calm about him that came not from confidence but from endurance. He had survived too much to be easily shaken. He had just finished lowering the lift when the sound reached him. Not the rumble of an ordinary engine, but something smoother, deeper, controlled. The sound of wealth moving through a place that had never asked for it. The white SUV rolled into the lot like it had taken a wrong turn out of another world. Polished to a mirror finish, its presence made the cracked asphalt beneath it look smaller, meaner. The vehicle stopped with surgical precision in front of the garage. Edrick stood still, the rag forgotten in his hands. The driver's door opened first. Seraphina Blackwell stepped out, tall and composed, her posture rigid with exhaustion rather than pride. She wore a tailored dress the color of sunlight filtered through glass, heels unsuited for concrete, her hair pulled back with deliberate care. She looked like someone accustomed to being listened to, yet her eyes carried the unmistakable dullness of disappointment. She did not look around at the garage. She did not take in the rust or the clutter. Her attention was fixed entirely on the passenger door. When it opened, time seemed to slow. Ione Blackwell emerged carefully, one hand braced against the door frame. She was 19, lean through the shoulders, her arms strong in a way that suggested years of compensating for what her legs could not do. From the waist down, her body was encased in a complex exoskeletal brace, silver and carbon fiber, jointed and reinforced, secured with straps that hugged her thighs and calves too tightly to ever be comfortable. As she stood, a flicker crossed her face. Pain quickly masked. The brace locked into position with a faint mechanical click. Edrick felt it before he understood it. A subtle wrongness, like hearing a note played just off-key. He watched the angle of her knees, the way her hips pulled back unnaturally, the tension in her jaw as she adjusted her weight. "That brace is fighting her," he said, barely above a murmur. Seraphina's head snapped toward him. "Excuse me." Edrick realized he had spoken aloud. He straightened, suddenly aware of the gulf between them. "Sorry. Didn't mean to intrude." Seraphina's gaze sharpened. That brace was designed by one of the top orthopedic firms in Europe. It cost more than this building. Edrick nodded once. "Doesn't mean it's right." The words hung between them, heavy and unwelcome. Ione shifted slightly, her hand tightening on the door. The movement sent another ripple of strain through her frame, subtle but unmistakable. Seraphina saw it too. Her composure cracked for half a second. "Our engine stalled," she said stiffly. "Can you fix it or not?" Edrick gestured toward the bay. "I can take a look." As he connected the diagnostic tool, Seraphina paced a few steps away, speaking into her phone in a low, controlled voice. Words like delays and appointments drifted through the air, the language of someone accustomed to solutions that arrived on demand. Edrick worked quickly, but his attention kept returning to the girl standing near the SUV. He watched how carefully she shifted her weight, how every movement seemed premeditated, calculated to avoid triggering pain. 12 years of this, he thought. He did not know how he knew the number, only that it felt right. Long enough for hope to turn brittle. The diagnostic screen flashed an error. A simple failure, easily fixed. As he tightened the final connection, he spoke again, quieter this time. "If you don't mind me saying something." Seraphina ended her call and turned back, impatience written across her face. "Make it quick." "That brace locks her knees as the control point," Edrick said. "But balance doesn't start there. It starts higher. She's fighting gravity every step." There was no accusation in his tone, only observation. Seraphina let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're a mechanic." Edrick met her eyes. "And airplanes stay in the air because of mechanics." Silence followed, the kind that stretched not because it was awkward, but because something dangerous had been introduced. Ione spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady, though it cost her effort. "He's not wrong about the pain." Seraphina's shoulders sagged just slightly. Years of consultations, specialists, promises. Millions spent chasing an answer that never arrived. She looked at Edrick again, really looked this time. At the grease under his nails, the calm certainty in his stance, the way he had noticed what no one else had bothered to see. "What would you do differently?" she asked. The question landed heavier than any threat. Edrick felt the past stir, the memory of a hospital room and a promise whispered too late. He thought of his son at the table behind him, pencil tapping softly against paper. He thought of how much it cost to be wrong. "I'd start by letting her body lead," he said. "Not the machine." The engine coughed, then settled into a smooth idle. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Seraphina nodded once, slowly. "All right," she said. "Show me." Edrick did not sleep that night. He sat alone in the garage long after the doors were shut, the echo of Seraphina Blackwell's question still pressing against his chest. What would you do differently? It was not a challenge. It was an invitation. And invitations like that had ruined his life once before. He cleaned his tools slowly, deliberately, as if precision might steady the thoughts crowding his head. Calder had fallen asleep on the couch in the back room, his schoolbook open on his chest. Edrick covered him with a blanket before returning to the main bay, where the silence felt heavier than noise. He opened a metal cabinet few people noticed. Inside were not spare parts or manuals, but notebooks stacked with obsessive care. Old engineering texts, diagrams drawn in tight, disciplined lines, calculations rewritten again and again until they felt inevitable. He had once been known for this, before everything ended. At 22, Edrick Vale had been one of the youngest structural engineering graduates in his program. He had been recruited early, praised for intuition as much as accuracy. He could look at a load-bearing system and sense imbalance before the numbers confirmed it. Professors called it instinct. He called it listening. Then Maribel died. A drunk driver ran a red light and erased her future in seconds. The grief hollowed him out, but he kept working because stopping felt worse. 2 years later, his younger brother Rowan was injured at a construction site outside Santa Cruz. A temporary support failed under shifting weight. Edrick had reviewed the plans weeks earlier. He had flagged the calculation as risky. He had assumed someone else would correct it. Rowan never walked again. The doctor spoke carefully. Permanent paralysie. Limited options. Edrick heard only one word. Permanent. He stayed by Rowan's side through months of therapy, watching machines attempt to force movement where the body resisted. Rowan endured the pain without complaint until the night he finally asked the question that still haunted Edrick. "You knew this could happen, didn't you?" Edrick did not lie. Rowan nodded once. He never brought it up again. Years later, when Rowan's health failed and the hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and resignation, he took Edrick's hand with what strength he had left. "If you ever figure out how the body really moves," Rowan whispered, "promise you'll help someone like me." That promise was the reason Edrick now stood alone in his garage, staring at a brace that did not belong to him, tracing its lines with his eyes, as if it were a machine he could already hear failing. Seraphina had agreed to let him examine it more closely, not because she trusted him, but because she had run out of people to trust. The next morning, she returned with Ione just after sunrise. The garage was quiet, the light slanting through the open doors. Edrick moved with care, asking permission before touching anything, explaining every adjustment before he made it. He studied the brace the way he once studied aircraft frames. He noted how the knee joint was fixed at a rigid angle, how the load transferred downward instead of upward, how the hip was treated as an afterthought rather than the core of balance. This system assumes stability starts at the knee, he said carefully. But that's not how humans walk. That's how machines move when they are bolted to the ground. Seraphina crossed her arms. Doctors designed this. Doctors treat symptoms, Edrick replied. Engineers deal with forces. Ione listened closely. She had learned to recognize empty explanations. This was not one of them. What happens if you're wrong? Seraphina asked. Edrick did not hesitate. Then I stop. Immediately. There were lawyers who would have advised against this moment. Forms that should have been signed. Waivers drafted in airtight language. None of that happened. What passed between them instead was something quieter and far more dangerous. Trust. Edrick worked through the night, making careful adjustments. He did not rebuild the brace. Not yet. He corrected what he believed were obvious misalignments, loosening here, reinforcing there, changing angles by degrees, so small they would go unnoticed by anyone not looking for them. By morning, his hands shook from exhaustion. They gathered in the center of the garage. Calder watched from the doorway, sensing that something important was happening, but not yet understanding why it scared him. Ione stepped forward. Edrick knelt to check the final fastenings, his voice steady even as his heart pounded. Tell me the moment something feels wrong. She nodded. She stood. The brace held. For a fraction of a second, hope surged so violently through Edrick that it stole his breath. Then Ione took a step. The brace shifted. Not dramatically. Not visibly to an untrained eye. But enough. Pain flashed across her face. A sharp cry broke from her throat as the joint slipped and skin tore beneath the strap. She collapsed before Edrick could reach her. Blood stained the concrete. Seraphina screamed his name, shoving him back as she dropped to her knees beside her daughter. Her composure shattered completely, replaced by terror and fury. You hurt her, she said, her voice breaking. I trusted you. Edrick stood frozen, horror spreading through him with the sickening familiarity of memory. The sound of hospital monitors, the smell of antiseptic, another failure layered onto the last. Seraphina called for help. Threats followed in sharp, breathless bursts. Lawyers. Consequences. Prison. Edrick barely heard them. He watched as Ione was helped to her feet, the brace removed with shaking hands. She did not look at him as they left. The garage fell silent. Calder stepped forward slowly. Dad, he said, his voice small. You didn't mean to. Edrick sank onto a stool, his strength gone. He stared at Rowan's old notebook lying open on the workbench, diagrams of human gaits sketched in fading ink. He had promised never to fail like this again. And yet he had. Outside, the sound of the white SUV faded into the distance, carrying with it whatever hope had briefly taken root. Edrick did not know if he had the right to try again. He only knew that stopping felt like breaking a promise he had already broken once before. The garage remained closed the day after Seraphina Blackwell drove away. Edrick did not answer calls. He did not turn on the radio. He moved through the hours like someone underwater, every sound distant, every thought slowed by weight. The stain on the concrete, where Ione's blood had touched it, would not wash away. He scrubbed until his arms ached, then scrubbed again, as if effort alone might erase memory. By evening, the sun had slipped low enough to throw long shadows through the cracks beneath the door. Calder sat on the edge of the workbench, swinging his legs, watching his father with a seriousness that did not belong to a 9-year-old. Are we closing forever? Calder asked quietly. Edrick stopped scrubbing. He leaned the brush against the bucket and sat back on his heels. No, he said, though the word felt thin in his mouth. Just for today. Calder nodded, accepting the answer without argument. He picked up the old notebook Edrick had left open, its pages curled with age. He traced a diagram with his finger, careful not to smudge the ink. Uncle Rowan drew these, Calder said. Yes. He said you were the only one who understood why his legs felt heavy, Calder went on. He looked up. Did you stop understanding? The question landed gently, but it cut deeper than any accusation. Edrick closed his eyes. He saw Rowan's face as it had been near the end, pale but calm, trusting him with something he had not earned yet. I don't know, Edrick said. Calder slid off the bench and stood close. You always tell me that when something doesn't work, it means it's telling you something. Not that you're bad at it. Edrick opened his eyes. He studied his son's face, the certainty there, the faith that had survived watching his father come apart more than once. Calder handed him the notebook. Maybe it's still talking. After Calder went to bed, Edrick returned to the workbench. He did not touch the brace. He did not touch his tools. He read. He read Rowan's notes as if they had been written by a stranger, free of guilt and memory. He followed the logic instead of the grief. Load transfer. Center of mass. The difference between forcing motion and allowing it. Sometime after midnight, his phone buzzed. A single message. From an unknown number. It's Ione. I told my mother not to block you. Edrick's chest tightened. He stared at the screen, unsure if he deserved to respond. Then another message appeared. It hurt, but it hurt differently. When I stood, something felt closer to right, like my body almost recognized it. He read the words again and again. Not forgiveness, not permission, but information. That was when the noise in his head finally went quiet. He looked back at the notebook, at a sketch Rowan had labeled simply balance. The hips drawn as a floating axis, arrows showing movement that adapted rather than resisted. At 3:17 in the morning, Edrick understood what he had missed. The brace did not need to be stronger. It needed to move. Every design he had seen assumed stability came from locking the body into place. But human balance was dynamic. The center of control was not fixed. It shifted with every step, every correction, every instinctive adjustment the body made without conscious thought. The brace had been built like a scaffold. It needed to behave like a spine. Edrick stood so fast the stool behind him toppled over. He pulled out blank paper and began to draw, hand steady now, mind clear. He sketched a system that allowed micro-movement at the hip, a floating center of balance that redistributed load in real time instead of fighting it. The implications were terrifying. So were the costs. By morning, Edrick had made a list. There was no room for hesitation. He sold his truck to a scrap dealer before noon. He withdrew the small savings he had set aside for Calder's future, hands shaking as he signed the forms. He told himself he would replace it, that he had to. He returned to the garage with materials salvaged from places he once worked. Aerospace scrap. Precision joints discarded for being too expensive to justify. Components designed to withstand forces far greater than the human body would ever produce. He built without sleeping. The new brace did not look impressive. It was leaner, less rigid. The joints at the hip were engineered to respond, not resist. The system listened. By the third day, his hands were blistered and his eyes burned, but the design was complete. Edrick called Seraphina once. She did not answer. He left a message. No explanations. No promises. Just one sentence. I believe I know why it failed. I would like one more chance to show you. Hours passed without response. As the sun began to set, a car pulled into the lot. It was not the white SUV. It was Seraphina's assistant, stepping out carefully, eyes scanning the garage. She's coming, the woman said. This is not forgiveness. This is a test. Edrick nodded. That's all I'm asking. When Seraphina arrived, her face was unreadable. Ione stood beside her, leaning slightly on a cane, the old brace absent. The garage doors were open. Neighbors had gathered without being invited, drawn by rumor and curiosity. Calder stood near the doorway, hands clasped tight. Edrick brought the new brace forward. He explained every component calmly, simply, as if teaching rather than defending. Ione listened. She always listened. When she stepped into the brace, the air seemed to still. Edrick checked the final fitting, his voice low. This will feel different, he said. Tell me everything. She nodded. She stood. The brace adjusted almost imperceptibly, responding to her weight. Ione inhaled sharply. Edrick stepped back. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted one foot from the ground and held it there. Ione's foot hovered above the concrete, steady enough that the silence around it grew heavy. Edrick watched the brace, more than he watched her, eyes tracing the subtle movements he had designed into it. The hip joint shifted almost invisibly, redistributing weight the way a living body should. No lacking. No resistance. Just response. Do you feel pain? He asked quietly. Ione shook her head, disbelief flickering across her face. No, she said. I feel balanced. Seraphina's hands were clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone white. She did not speak. She barely breathed. Ione took a step. The sound was soft, rubber sole against concrete, ordinary, and yet it landed like thunder. A murmur rippled through the small crowd gathered at the garage entrance. Neighbors leaned forward. Calder's hands flew to his mouth. Edrick felt his chest tighten as Ione took another step, then another, each one smoother than the last. She stopped halfway across the bay, as if afraid to trust what was happening. Then she laughed, a sound that startled her as much as anyone else. "I don't have to think about it," she said. "My legs are just moving." Seraphina broke. She crossed the distance in a rush, tears spilling freely now, and wrapped her arms around her daughter. The years of restraint, of controlled grief and measured hope, collapsed all at once. She sank to her knees on the oil-stained floor, holding Ione as if she might vanish if she let go. "You're walking," she whispered. "You're really walking." Ione held her mother tightly, tears sliding down her own face. "I can feel the ground," she said. "It doesn't hurt." Edrick stood back, hands trembling, afraid to interfere with something sacred. He felt Rowan's presence as sharply as if his brother were standing beside him, watching, waiting. The moment did not belong to him. It never had. News spread faster than Edrick could process. A video appeared online that evening, filmed by someone who had been standing near the door. By morning, his phone would not stop ringing. The brace manufacturer sent a letter first. A cease and desist, dense with legal language and threats. The medical board followed, warning him that he was practicing without a license and could face serious consequences. Words like liability and prosecution replaced miracle in the conversation around his name. Seraphina refused to let him face it alone. She held a press conference 2 days later, standing in front of a wall of cameras with Ione beside her, walking unaided except for the brace Edrick had built. She did not soften her words. "We spent 12 years and millions of dollars trusting systems that never listened to my daughter's body," she said. "One man did, and when institutions tried to silence him, I chose to speak." The hearing that followed was clinical, cold. Edrick sat at a narrow table, hands folded, listening as his work was questioned by people who had never watched Ione take a step. He answered carefully, never claiming more than he could prove. Then Dr. Alistair Crown spoke. He was older than Edrick had imagined, his voice steady, his reputation unmistakable. He explained the design with clarity, validating what Edrick had built not as accident, but as insight. "This is not recklessness," Crown said. "It is mechanical intuition applied where it was long overdue. The results speak." They did. The decision came weeks later. A special license, oversight, boundaries, enough legitimacy to keep the doors open. Edrick returned to the garage with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He did not expand. He did not move. He changed the sign. Vale Mobility Works. People came quietly at first. Parents with children who had learned to expect pain. Adults who had been told adaptation was the best they could hope for. Edrick worked the same way he always had. Listening. Adjusting. Letting the body lead. Those who could pay did. Those who could not were never turned away. On a bright morning months later, Edrick stood barefoot at the edge of the shoreline, the tide rolling in with patient rhythm. Ione ran ahead of him, laughing as the water chased her feet. She moved without fear now, without calculation. Seraphina watched from a distance, her expression calm in a way it had never been before. Edrick closed his eyes and breathed in the salt air. He thought of a hospital room, of a promise made too late, of a notebook filled with sketches and hope. "I kept it," he whispered, not to the sea, but to the memory of a brother who had trusted him with something unfinished. The waves answered by reaching his feet, steady and sure, as if to say that balance, once found, could always be felt again.